The wreckage floated in silence, twisted metal catching starlight like broken teeth. David Ross guided his salvage ship closer, scanning for anything worth pulling from the debris field. 3 days had passed since the Galactic Concordat dropped their payload on this outpost, and the cleanup contracts were already posted. Someone had to collect the scrap, catalog the remains, and file the boring reports nobody would read. His scanner beeped. Metal signatures everywhere, some fuel cells still intact, maybe a few computer cores he could resell. Standard job. He maneuvered between chunks of hull plating, his ship's arms extending to grab the valuable pieces. This was his 4th salvage run this month, and none of them got easier. People died here, even if they were smugglers like the reports claimed. Death smelled the same regardless of who it took. Something moved on his peripheral scanner. David frowned and checked the reading again. Biological signature, faint but present. Probably a ship rat or some other vermin that survived the blast. He marked it in his log and kept working, pulling apart a section of what used to be a medical bay. The movement registered again, stronger this time. His scanner showed it was in the wreckage directly ahead, buried under collapsed bulkheads. David stopped his work and stared at the readings. Too large for a rat, too warm. His hands moved across the controls before his brain caught up, clearing debris with his ship's manipulator arms. A small compartment appeared, its door half melted but still sealed. Emergency shelter, the kind meant to protect people during decompression events. David's heart started beating faster. The Concordat report said everyone died in the initial strike. Clean operation, no survivors, case closed. He forced the door open with a hydraulic claw. Inside, wedged between supply crates and breathing apparatus, a child stared back at him through his external cameras. A human child, female, maybe 6 years old. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She did not move, did not cry out, just watched his ship with enormous dark eyes that had seen too much. David forgot about the salvage contract. He forgot about the scrap metal and the resale values. He brought his ship alongside the shelter and opened his own airlock, extending a boarding tunnel. The child did not run when he entered. She simply sat there, shaking, her small body wrapped in an emergency blanket that was 3 sizes too large. "Hey there," David said softly, kneeling down to her level. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me your name?" She said nothing. Her eyes tracked his movements, but she made no sound. He checked her vital signs with a medical scanner. Dehydrated, malnourished, in shock, but alive. Against all odds and military reports, alive. David carried her back to his ship, moving slowly so he would not scare her more than she already was. He settled her in his small living quarters and gave her water, just small sips at first. She drank like someone who had forgotten what water tasted like. He found emergency rations and warmed them up, watching as she ate in mechanical bites, her hands trembling. While she ate, David went through the outpost's recovered data cores. Medical research facility, the files said. Dr. Patricia Wells, xenobiology specialist, worked here with her daughter. There were school assignments saved in the personal files, drawings of stars and ships, a child's diary about missing Earth and wanting to see real oceans again. The Concordat strike authorization was filed under military necessity. Smuggling operation, illegal weapons cache, immediate threat to regional security. Authorization for lethal force granted. The medical facility was listed as a front operation. Dr. Wells was classified as a collaborator. Her daughter was not mentioned anywhere in the official documentation. David read the after-action report 3 times. 14 confirmed casualties, all hostile combatants or support personnel. Infrastructure destroyed per mission parameters. Site secured and cleared, recommended for commendation. He looked back at the child eating protein bars in his quarters and felt something cold settle in his chest. She was not hostile. She was not a combatant. She was a little girl who watched her mother die and spent 3 days alone in the dark waiting for someone to find her. The Concordat had not even checked. They dropped their bombs, confirmed their kills, and left. Nobody verified the bodies. Nobody swept for survivors. Nobody cared enough to look. David filed his salvage report that night, documenting everything he found, including 1 survivor recovered from emergency shelter. He attached medical scans, photographs, and data core evidence. He sent it through official channels to the nearest Concordat station and waited for their response. It came 6 hours later. Thank you for your report. Survivor will be processed through standard refugee protocols. Compensation credit transferred for recovery assistance. File closed. That was it. No questions about how she survived. No curiosity about why their casualty count was wrong. No acknowledgement that they had left a child to die in the wreckage of her home. Just a credit transfer and a closed file. David looked at the girl sleeping in his quarters, finally exhausted enough to rest. She had not spoken a single word since he found her. Trauma did that sometimes, locked the voice away where the pain could not reach it. He did not know if she would ever speak again. He did not know if she had other family, other connections, anyone in the universe who knew she existed. What he did know was that the Concordat had labeled her collateral damage and moved on, an acceptable loss, a rounding error in their military efficiency reports. David Ross was not a violent man. He had served his time in colony defense forces and learned that fighting solved less than people thought. He preferred fixing things to breaking them, salvaging rather than destroying. But he was human, and humans had certain lines they did not cross. You did not leave children behind. You did not label them acceptable losses. You did not close the file and forget they existed. He pulled up the Concordat charter on his computer and started reading. Somewhere in that legal framework was a crack, a weakness, a way to make them answer for what they had done. He would find it. He would make them look at this child and justify their choices. They had made their first mistake when they assumed nobody would care. Their second mistake was thinking a single human would accept their answer and walk away. David had all the time in the world, and humans were very good at holding grudges. The Concordat was about to learn exactly what that meant. The news feeds across a dozen systems carried the same headline that week. Human recovers child from Concordat strike zone. Most species scrolled past it without much interest. Humans finding survivors was not exactly news. They had a reputation for that sort of thing. Ambassador Quinn of the Tevari delegation read the story with more attention than most. She had worked alongside humans for 7 years now and still found them baffling. The article mentioned a salvage operator named David Ross who pulled a child from wreckage 3 days after a military operation. 3 days. Most species would have scanned once, found nothing, and departed. Humans kept looking. Quinn remembered the Velos Station incident 5 years back. A cascade failure left 200 people trapped in the lower sections. Every government declared the rescue too dangerous after the third structural collapse, except the humans. They went in anyway, losing 12 of their own people to save 43 aliens they had never met. When asked why they took such risks, the human rescue coordinator said something that still confused Quinn. Because somebody had to try. The concept made no logical sense. The probability of success had been low. The risk to the rescuers was extreme. Any reasonable cost-benefit analysis said to evacuate and cut losses. But humans did not seem to calculate risk the same way other species did. They had this strange defect where sometimes they just decided something mattered more than their own survival. Other species had a word for humans now. Honey badgers, named after some small earth creature that fought animals 10 times its size and refused to quit even when losing. The name started as a joke but became accepted terminology. When you needed someone who would not give up, you called a human. When you needed someone who would walk into impossible situations, you called a human. When you needed someone stupid enough to try when everyone else quit, you definitely called a human. David Ross fit the pattern perfectly. Quinn read his service record, which was public information for anyone who knew where to look. Colony defense volunteer for 6 years, participated in 3 evacuation operations, twice recommended for citations he never accepted. Left service to run salvage operations in the outer reaches where most people avoided working. No family on record, no close ties, just a man who fixed broken things for a living. The file mentioned one incident during his service. A colony ship suffered engine failure and started falling into a gas giant's gravity well. Command ordered evacuation of nearby vessels. David Ross ignored the order and matched trajectory with the dying ship, using his own vessel's engines to slow their descent long enough for the colony ship to restart their systems. His ship sustained critical damage. He nearly died from radiation exposure. When disciplined for disobeying orders, he said he knew the colony ship had children aboard, and he could not just watch them fall. That was 7 years ago. Apparently, he had not changed much. Quinn accessed the Concordat files on the outpost strike. Standard military operation, authorized under security protocols, executed within acceptable parameters. 14 casualties confirmed, all listed as hostile or support personnel. The strike commander was Telvik, an Aurelian with a distinguished record and 40 years of service. By every measure, he had done his job correctly. Except he had missed a child in the wreckage, or more accurately, he had not looked for one. The Concordat protocols were clear. After-strike verification was recommended but not required in hostile zones. Risk to verification teams was considered against probable survivor count. In most cases, the math said do not go back. Most species accepted this logic. Most species understood that some deaths could not be prevented and some risks were not worth taking. Humans rejected that math entirely. They had this infuriating tendency to decide the improbable was still worth attempting. A child might be alive in the wreckage. The odds were low but not zero. Therefore, someone should look. The logic was simple, maddening, and completely human. Quinn pulled up the response David Ross sent after the Concordat offered him compensation. It was brief and direct. I do not want credits. I want to know why nobody checked for survivors. I want to know why you assumed everyone was dead. I want to know what procedures you followed to verify there were no children in that facility before you destroyed it. The Concordat response was equally brief. Military operations follow established protocols. Casualty verification is conducted per risk assessment guidelines. The matter is closed. David's next message was even shorter. Then I guess we have a problem. That was 2 days ago. Since then, David had contacted 4 different human legal firms specializing in interspecies law. He requested copies of every Concordat charter provision regarding civilian casualties. He filed formal inquiries with 3 separate oversight committees. He was not going away, and that meant trouble. Quinn had seen this pattern before. A human decided something was wrong and started pushing. They did not push with violence or threats. They pushed with paperwork, with legal precedents, with questions that should have simple answers but somehow did not. They pushed until someone either fixed the problem or made the mistake of pushing back. The Concordat was about to push back. Quinn could see it coming. Commander Telvik had already filed a complaint about harassment. The legal department was preparing responses about frivolous inquiries and abuse of oversight systems. They were treating David Ross like a nuisance who would eventually get tired and quit. They did not understand what they were dealing with. Humans did not quit. That was their whole thing. You could beat them, out-resource them, outmaneuver them, but you could not make them accept defeat. They just kept coming, kept pushing, kept finding new ways to be a problem until someone addressed their concerns. The child was still with David, according to the reports. Medical scans showed she was recovering physically but remained nonverbal. Trauma specialists said it might take months or years before she spoke again, if ever. David had applied for temporary guardianship, which was granted automatically since no other relatives were found. He named her Hope in the official documents, though her birth name was listed as Sarah Wells. Quinn wondered if David understood what he was starting. One human against the largest military alliance in known space, demanding they justify leaving a child in the rubble. Most species would call it suicide. Humans would call it Tuesday. She filed her own report for the Tevari delegation, flagging the situation as one to watch. Humans were unpredictable in general, but angry humans were downright dangerous. Not because they were violent, but because they were persistent. They held grudges for generations. They remembered every slight, every injustice, every broken promise, and they never, ever forgot when someone hurt a child. The Concordat had made their first mistake by assuming the child did not matter. Their second mistake would be assuming David Ross would back down when pressured. Quinn had worked with humans long enough to know how this would end. The only question was how much damage would occur before the Concordat realized they could not win this fight. Somewhere on a salvage ship in the outer reaches, a stubborn human was reading legal documents and taking notes. He had all the time in the world and absolutely nothing to lose. That made him the most dangerous person in the galaxy, and the Concordat did not even know it yet. Ruth Alvarez had seen a lot of strange cases in her 20 years practicing interspecies law, but this one was different. The man sitting across from her looked tired, the kind of tired that came from not sleeping because sleep meant stopping and stopping meant giving up. He had brought a child with him, a small girl who sat quietly in the corner playing with a datapad, her eyes rarely leaving the man she clearly trusted. "Let me understand this correctly," Ruth said, reviewing the documents David had sent ahead. "You found this child 3 days after a Concordat military strike. You reported it to them. They sent you a credit transfer and closed the case. And now you want to sue the most powerful military alliance in the galaxy because they did not check for survivors." "Yes," David said simply. Ruth leaned back in her chair. She had built her reputation on finding loopholes in treaties that everyone assumed were airtight. Governments hired her to navigate complex trade disputes. Corporations paid her substantial fees to untangle regulatory nightmares. She was good at her job, maybe the best in human space. But this was not about loopholes. This was about making the Concordat care about something they had already decided did not matter. "You understand the odds here," Ruth said carefully. "The Concordat has legal immunity for military operations conducted under their security charter. Civilian casualties are addressed through a compensation fund, which they already offered you. There is no precedent for challenging their operational decisions." "Then we make precedent," David said. Ruth studied him. She had met plenty of angry clients over the years, people who wanted revenge more than justice. David was not angry, at least not in any way she could easily read. He was determined, which was somehow worse. Anger burned out eventually. Determination just kept going. "The compensation fund exists specifically to prevent lawsuits," Ruth explained. "By accepting the credit transfer, you acknowledge their authority to determine casualty classifications. You have no legal standing to challenge their decision." "I did not accept it," David said, pulling up his account records. "The credits are still sitting in the transfer queue. I have not touched them." Ruth raised an eyebrow. That was interesting. Most people took the money even if they were unhappy about it. David had left it sitting there for 2 weeks untouched, like it was poisoned. In legal terms, that meant he had not accepted the settlement. The case was technically still open. "That gives us a window," Ruth said slowly, her mind already working through possibilities. "The Concordat Charter requires accountability for civilian casualties, but there is a time limit. If no legal representative files a formal challenge within 30 cycles, the case automatically closes, and the compensation stands as final resolution." "How long do we have?" David asked. 19 cycles, about 3 weeks in Earth Standard Time. David nodded like he had expected this. "What do we need to do?" Ruth pulled up the charter documentation and started reading sections she had not looked at in years. The accountability provision was buried deep in the treaty, added during the original negotiations as a compromise with species who worried about military overreach. Nobody had actually used it in over 2 centuries because the process was intentionally difficult. You needed standing, evidence, and a compelling argument that the Concordat had violated their own standards. "We need to prove they failed to follow their own protocols," Ruth said, highlighting relevant sections. "The charter requires reasonable efforts to verify civilian presence before military action. After action, they are supposed to conduct casualty assessment to ensure compliance with engagement rules. If we can show they skipped these steps or performed them inadequately, we have grounds for a tribunal review." "They did not check," David said. "I found Hope 3 days later. If they had sent anyone back to verify, they would have found her." "But was checking required?" Ruth asked. "That is the question. If the zone was designated hostile, if the risk assessment said verification would endanger personnel, then they can argue they followed protocol by not going back. David was quiet for a moment. So we need to prove the zone was not that dangerous, or that they should have known civilians might be present. Exactly. Ruth pulled up the strike authorization documents. They classified the outpost as a smuggling operation with weapons cache. That classification justified lethal force. But if we can show the facility was primarily medical research, if we can prove they had evidence of civilian presence and ignored it, then we can argue they violated their own rules. She spent the next hour going through the recovered data cores David had salvaged. Dr. Patricia Wells had published research papers. Her work was legitimate, peer-reviewed, cited by institutions across the galaxy. The outpost had medical licenses, supply manifests for research equipment, educational materials for her daughter. Nothing in the records suggested smuggling or weapons. Where did they get their intelligence? Ruth asked. David pulled up the strike authorization. Anonymous tip reported illegal weapons cache and smuggling activities. Concordat intelligence confirmed the report through remote surveillance. Authorization granted based on threat assessment. Anonymous tip, Ruth repeated. No verification of the source, no ground intelligence, just remote scans that showed what exactly. David showed her the surveillance data. Heat signatures consistent with power generation. Metal deposits consistent with weapons manufacturing. Transport ships arriving and departing on irregular schedules. All of it could be interpreted as smuggling activity if you wanted to see it that way. It could also be interpreted as a remote research station receiving supply shipments and running generators for lab equipment. They saw what they expected to see, Ruth said. Confirmation bias. They got a tip, ran some scans that fit the narrative, and authorized the strike without deeper investigation. Is that enough? David asked. Ruth considered. Maybe. If we can get this in front of a tribunal, if we can make them look at the actual evidence instead of the assumptions. The problem is getting standing to demand a hearing. The Concordat does not want to set a precedent of civilians questioning their military decisions. What if we are not questioning their decisions? David said. What if we are just asking them to follow their own rules? They have protocols for verification. They have procedures for casualty assessment. We are not saying they were wrong to strike the outpost. We are saying they were wrong to not check if anyone survived. Ruth smiled. That was the angle. Do not attack their authority. Do not question their military necessity. Just hold them to their own stated standards. Ask them to be what they claimed to be, a professional military force that took reasonable precautions to protect civilian life. This is going to get ugly, Ruth warned. The Concordat does not like being challenged. They will pressure you. They will try to make this go away quietly. David glanced at the child in the corner. Hope was watching them now, her dark eyes taking in everything even though she made no sound. Let them try, he said quietly. I have been pressured before. Ruth began drafting the formal challenge that night. It was a masterpiece of legal precision, citing every relevant charter provision, documenting every procedural failure, building a case that was technically unassailable even if it was politically inconvenient. She filed it through official channels exactly 19 cycles after the strike, with one cycle to spare before the window closed. The response from the Concordat was swift and cold. Challenge received and rejected. No basis for tribunal review. Case closed. Compensation remains available. Matter finalized. Ruth filed an appeal. David filed supporting documentation. Together they pushed back against every rejection, every dismissal, every attempt to close the door. And slowly, reluctantly, the legal machinery of the galaxy started to move. Somewhere in the Concordat headquarters, someone realized this human was not going away. Someone recognized that rejecting a legitimate challenge would look worse than granting a hearing. Someone made the calculation that it was easier to let the human have his day in court and lose properly than to keep fighting procedural battles. 3 weeks after Ruth filed the challenge, the tribunal agreed to hear the case. It would be a formal review of Concordat military action, the first in over 2 centuries. The galaxy was watching now, curious about the human who dared to question the unchallengeable. And David Ross prepared to make them answer for leaving a child in the dark. The tribunal chamber was designed to be impressive. High ceilings, elegant architecture, seats arranged so everyone could see the proceedings. Representatives from 40 species filled the gallery, watching with curiosity as the human lawyer stood to present her opening argument. Most expected this to be over quickly. Military tribunals rarely ruled against their own. Ruth Alvarez did not waste time with elaborate preambles. We are not here to question whether the Concordat had authority to strike the outpost. We are here to determine if they followed their own protocols when they did so. The charter is clear. Reasonable efforts must be made to verify civilian presence. Casualty assessment must be conducted after military action. These are not suggestions. These are requirements the Concordat wrote into their own founding documents. The Concordat prosecutor, a veteran Aurelian named Sir Vic, responded with practiced calm. The outpost was a hostile zone. Remote surveillance confirmed weapons signatures and smuggling activity. Ground verification would have endangered personnel for minimal probable benefit. The casualty count of 14 matched our projections. All protocols were followed. All except one, Ruth said. You did not check if anyone survived. The child we recovered was alive for 3 days after your strike. 3 days. If any verification team had returned to the site, they would have found her. Your protocols require casualty assessment. You did a body count from orbit and called it sufficient. Sir Vic pulled up tactical displays. The risk assessment determined that ground operations posed unacceptable danger. Secondary explosions were probable. Structural instability made the site hazardous. Sending teams into that environment would have violated safety protocols. Yet a civilian salvage operator entered that same environment 4 days later without incident, Ruth countered. David Ross, operating alone in a standard salvage ship, accessed the wreckage and recovered a survivor. If it was safe enough for one unarmed human, it was safe enough for your trained military teams. The tribunal judges, 3 species known for their neutrality, watched this exchange carefully. The lead judge, a Quellan named Resh, spoke in the clicking language his species used. The translator rendered his words precisely. The human salvager took greater risks than military protocols would allow. Individual risk tolerance does not determine institutional safety standards. Ruth nodded. Agreed. But the Concordat Charter does not say perform casualty assessment if convenient. It says perform casualty assessment. Risk is part of military operations. If every dangerous situation excused accountability requirements, the Charter means nothing. She pulled up Dr. Wells' research papers, her published work, the educational records for her daughter. This was not a smuggling operation. This was a legitimate research facility. Dr. Patricia Wells was a respected xenobiologist. Her work was cited by universities across the galaxy. Her daughter attended remote schooling programs registered with Earth. Educational authorities. None of this was hidden. All of it was publicly available information. Yet your intelligence classified this as a hostile site based on anonymous tips and ambiguous sensor data. Sir Vic responded smoothly. Intelligence gathering involves synthesis of multiple sources. An anonymous tip is not automatically invalid. The sensor data supported the assessment. We acted on the best available information. You acted on the easiest interpretation, Ruth said. You saw power generation and assumed weapons manufacturing. You saw irregular transport schedules and assumed smuggling. You took the path that justified military action without asking harder questions. And when you were done, you did not verify your assumptions. You did not check if the bodies in the rubble matched your intelligence. You did not confirm that everyone who died was actually hostile. You just moved on. The chamber was quiet now. Other representatives were leaning forward, paying attention. This was not about legal technicalities anymore. This was about whether the Concordat valued some lives more than others. David Ross took the stand next. He was not a practiced speaker, not comfortable with formal proceedings. He just told his story plainly, finding the wreckage, scanning for salvage, discovering the child. 3 days she waited in the dark, breathing recycled air from an emergency shelter, watching her supplies run out, probably thinking nobody was coming. "Why did you check?" Judge Resch asked. "Your contract was for salvage recovery. Finding survivors was not your responsibility." David was quiet for a moment. "Because I am human," he said finally. "We have a saying back home, you do not leave people behind, not because it is always possible to save them, but because trying is what separates us from the people we fight against. I checked because someone should have checked already. Someone should have cared enough to look." Sir Vic stood to cross-examine. "You have a history of taking unnecessary risks. Your service record shows multiple disciplinary actions for disregarding orders. You nearly died during the colony ship incident. Would you say your judgment about acceptable risk is typical for most species?" "No," David said honestly. "Most species are smarter than humans about risk management, but we are talking about a child. There is no risk calculation that makes it acceptable to not verify if. Children are in the rubble. You either check or you admit you do not care enough to check. There is no middle ground." "The Concordat cares deeply about civilian protection," Sir Vic said firmly. "Our protocols exist to minimize casualties while maintaining operational effectiveness. We cannot rebuild our entire military doctrine because one human thinks we should check every site after every operation." "I am not asking you to rebuild anything," David said. "I am asking you to follow your own rules. You wrote the charter. You put those accountability requirements in there. Either they matter or they do not. You decide." The testimony continued for 3 days. Military experts testified about risk assessment and operational doctrine. Legal scholars debated charter interpretation and precedent. The gallery filled with more observers each day as word spread about the human challenging the Concordat. Hope sat in the front row throughout it all, silent and watching, the living proof that someone had been left behind. On the 4th day, Ruth made her closing argument. "This case is not complicated. The Concordat has protocols for a reason. Those protocols exist because they know mistakes happen, because they understand military operations can go wrong, because they want to be better than just efficient killing machines. We are asking them to honor those protocols, to verify before they strike, to check after they fire, to treat every life as if it matters because that is what their own charter requires. If they cannot do that, if the rules only apply when convenient, then what is the point of having rules at all?" Sir Vic's closing was equally direct. "Military operations require difficult choices. Second-guessing those choices from the safety of a courtroom dishonors the personnel who execute them. Commander Telvik followed established procedures. The strike was authorized, executed, and documented per regulation. One survivor does not invalidate the operation. Tragedy does not equal negligence. We ask the tribunal to recognize the difference." Judge Resch conferred with the other tribunal members for 6 hours. When they returned, the chamber was packed. Every seat filled, every screen broadcasting to watching systems across the galaxy. This was history now, whether they intended it or not. "We find the Concordat did not violate the letter of their protocols," Judge Resch said. The Concordat representatives relaxed slightly. "However, we find their interpretation of those protocols was insufficient to meet the spirit of their charter obligations. The failure to conduct ground verification when a civilian salvager could safely access the site 3 days later represents a gap between stated values and actual practice. We recommend the Concordat review and revise their casualty assessment procedures to ensure future compliance with accountability requirements." It was not a victory, it was not a defeat. It was an acknowledgement that something was wrong and needed fixing. The Concordat looked unhappy but not devastated. Ruth looked frustrated but not surprised. David just looked tired. As they left the chamber, reporters swarmed with questions. David ignored them all. Hope held his hand and walked beside him, still silent, still watching. They had not won, but they had made the galaxy pay attention. Sometimes that was enough to start change. Sometimes that was all you could do. The Concordat offered settlement 3 days after the tribunal recommendation. Full financial compensation, formal apology, revised protocols for future operations. The offer arrived through official channels with appropriate gravity and diplomatic language. They expected David to accept, declare victory, and move on. That was how these things usually ended. David read the offer twice and sent back a single sentence. I want Commander Telvik to admit he did not check because the lives there did not matter enough. The response took longer this time. The settlement offer increased. The apology became more elaborate. Policy changes were detailed extensively. Everything except what David actually asked for. Everything except accountability from the person who made the decision. Ruth met with him that evening, bringing documents that outlined exactly what they were refusing. This is a generous settlement by any standard, she said carefully. The policy changes alone are significant. They are agreeing to mandatory ground verification after strikes. They are creating independent oversight for civilian casualty assessments. You changed their entire operational doctrine. But Telvik gets to keep his commendation, David said. He gets to retire with honors. He gets to tell himself he did everything right and it was just bad luck that a child survived. You cannot force someone to feel guilt, Ruth said. The law is not about making people sorry, it is about preventing future harm. We got that. David looked at Hope, who was drawing pictures on a datapad in the corner. She had started making small sounds recently, not words but at least noise, progress, healing. She looked up and smiled at him, tiny and fragile and alive because someone bothered to look. They need to know it was wrong, David said quietly. Not just procedurally insufficient or against the spirit of their charter. Wrong. They left a child to die and they need to say it out loud. Ruth understood. She had represented enough clients to recognize when justice and closure were not the same thing. I will tell them the settlement is rejected. But David, they are not going to give you what you want. Admitting personal fault opens them to liability. Telvik would never agree and they would never force him. Then we keep going, David said. The rejection made news across the galaxy. Human refuses Concordat settlement. Analysts debated whether David was brave or foolish. Most species could not understand why he would turn down such a generous offer. The policy changes were real. The money would secure Hope's future. What more did he want? Humans understood. The news feeds from Earth and its colonies showed overwhelming support. Messages flooded in from people David had never met, thanking him for not backing down, for demanding more than just procedure and credits. Some sent money to help with legal fees. Others sent letters sharing their own experiences with institutions that offered everything except admission of wrongdoing. The Concordat noticed. They noticed human trade ships canceling contracts. They noticed human medical volunteers requesting transfers away from Concordat facilities. They noticed human engineers declining project bids in Aurelian space. None of it was organized. There was no official boycott. Humans were just individually deciding they did not want to work with people who thought children were acceptable losses. The economic impact was measurable within a week. The psychological impact was worse. The Concordat built its reputation on being the good guys, the professional military that protected the galaxy from chaos. Humans were quietly suggesting they were just better armed than the problems they claimed to solve. Commander Telvik gave an interview to restore his image. He appeared calm and reasonable, explaining that military necessity required hard choices. A commander cannot second-guess every decision. We operate in dangerous situations with incomplete information. I followed protocols, acted in good faith, and achieved the mission objectives. I am deeply sorry a child was in the facility, but that does not make the operation wrong. He said the critical sentence in the middle of explaining complex tactical decisions. One child's life cannot outweigh strategic objectives. The interview went viral for all the wrong reasons. News analysts played the clip repeatedly. One child's life cannot outweigh strategic objectives. The words hung in the air, impossible to take back, revealing exactly what David had been trying to expose. Telvik believed it. He genuinely thought some lives mattered less than mission success. Human response was immediate and unified. It was not rage or protest. It was something more unsettling. Cold, coordinated withdrawal, more trade contracts canceled, more volunteers departing, more projects going to other contractors. Human ships started routing around Concordat space entirely, adding days to their journeys to avoid stations that employed Telvik's philosophy. The Concordat tried damage control. Telvik was asked to clarify his remarks. He made it worse by doubling down, explaining that strategic thinking required prioritization and civilians in conflict zones accepted certain risks. Each attempt to explain just confirmed what humans already believed. He genuinely did not understand why one child's survival should change anything. Ambassador Quinn watched the disaster unfold with the resignation of someone who had seen this pattern before. Humans did not fight with weapons when they were angry. They fought with exclusion, with the slow withdrawal of cooperation, with making you realize how much you depended on their particular brand of stubborn helpfulness. The Concordat called an emergency session. Representatives from member species argued about proportional response and human overreaction. Some suggested sanctions against human trade. Others pointed out that would only make things worse because humans were spite-driven enough to accept economic hardship rather than back down from a principle. "We offered them everything reasonable," one representative protested. "Policy changes, compensation, formal apologies, what more can they want?" "They want us to care," Quinn said quietly. "They want us to value that child's life the same way they do, and we do not. That is what they cannot forgive." The Concordat leadership realized they had miscalculated. This was not a legal problem anymore. This was a problem of values, of fundamental disagreement about what mattered. They could win every legal argument and still lose because humans would simply refuse to work with them. 3 weeks after Telvik's interview, the Concordat made a decision. Commander Telvik was asked to retire early. His commendation for the operation was quietly rescinded. A formal review of the strike found procedural deficiencies and recommended additional training for strike authorization personnel. It was not an admission of guilt, but it was close enough to be painful. David read the announcement without satisfaction. They were still protecting Telvik, just retiring him with full pension instead of honors. Still framing it as procedural failure instead of moral failure. Still refusing to say the child mattered. But something had shifted. The Concordat's carefully maintained image as benevolent protectors was damaged. Other species were watching how humans responded to their actions. Questions were being asked about other operations, other casualties, other times when strategic objectives outweighed individual lives. Hope spoke her first word that week. She was looking at one of David's old photographs from Earth, a picture of an ocean at sunset. She pointed at it and said clearly, "Home." David felt tears he had been holding back for months, not because they had won. They had not won, not really. But because this child who had every reason to stop trusting, to stop hoping, to stop believing anyone cared, had just told him she wanted to see Earth. She wanted to see the world of the people who came back for her when everyone else walked away. That was worth more than any settlement. That was worth every argument, every rejected offer, every uncomfortable stand. Humans came back. That was the whole point. That was what the galaxy needed to remember. You could have all the strategic objectives and military necessity you wanted, but humans would judge you by who you left behind. And they would never, ever forget. 6 months after the tribunal, the Concordat implemented their new protocols. Every military strike now required post-action ground verification within 48 hours. Independent observers monitored casualty assessments. Civilian presence had to be confirmed or ruled out before sites were declared clear. The changes were substantial, exactly what David and Ruth had argued for. The galaxy moved on to other news. The tribunal became a case study in interspecies law classes. Commander Telvik retired to a quiet colony world where nobody asked about his service record. The Concordat rebuilt its relationship with human contractors slowly, carefully, learning to navigate the particular sensitivities humans had about accountability and children. David Ross went back to salvage work. He kept Hope with him, converting part of his ship into a small living space that felt more like home. She attended remote school programs and slowly learned to talk about what happened, about her mother, about the 3 days in the dark. Trauma specialists said she was healing as well as could be expected. David thought that was a low bar but accepted it. Hope was 8 years old now, taller and healthier than when he found her. She still had nightmares sometimes, still went quiet when loud noises startled her. But she also laughed, asked constant questions about how his salvage equipment worked, and insisted on helping with ship maintenance even though her small hands could barely reach the access panels. They were working on a job in the Velos sector when the message came through. The Concordat wanted to present David with a commendation for his advocacy work. Formal ceremony, full honors, recognition for changing military policy across the entire alliance. Ruth forwarded the invitation with a note saying it was good public relations and he should probably accept. David deleted the message without responding. He did not want their commendation. He did not want recognition for doing what should have been obvious. You check for survivors. You verify your casualties. You care about the lives you affect. These should not be controversial positions. Hope noticed his mood and climbed into the co-pilot seat beside him. "What is wrong?" she asked. Her voice was still quiet but steady now, gaining confidence. "Nothing important," David said. "Just people who want to give awards for things that should not need awards." She considered this seriously. At 8 years old, she was already better at reading his moods than most adults. "You are still angry at them." "Yes," David admitted. "I probably always will be." "Because they left me," Hope said, not a question, just a statement of fact she had come to understand. "Because they did not care enough to check," David corrected gently. "Because to them you were just a number in a report, acceptable losses, collateral damage." Hope was quiet for a moment, watching the stars drift past their viewport. "But you checked." "Yes." "Why?" David had been asked this question 100 times by reporters, lawyers, tribunal judges, and curious aliens who genuinely wanted to understand human psychology. He usually gave simple answers about doing the right thing or following his conscience. But Hope deserved the complete truth. "Because I am human," he said. "And humans have this defect in how we see the world. Most species calculate cost versus benefit. They make smart decisions based on probability and risk. We do that too, mostly. But sometimes we see something that just feels wrong and all the smart calculations stop mattering. We decide some things are more important than being safe or reasonable or practical." "Like finding me," Hope said. "Like finding you, the odds of anyone being alive in that wreckage were low. The smart move was to salvage the metal and move on, but I could not do it. Something in my brain just refused to accept that nobody checked, that nobody cared enough to look. So I looked, and I found you. And then I could not let it go because they still did not care. They offered money and apologies, but never actually admitted they were wrong to leave you." Hope thought about this. Are all humans like that? "Not all," David said honestly. "But enough. Enough that other species know if you hurt someone a human cares about, they will not let it go. Ever. They will push and fight and make your life difficult until you either fix the problem or they run out of ways to be a problem. We are annoying that way." "I like that you are annoying," Hope said with the ghost of a smile. News came through later that week about another change in Concordat policy. They were establishing a dedicated civilian protection office, independent from military command, responsible for verifying potential civilian presence before strike authorization. Ruth sent the article with 3 exclamation points and a message saying this was the real victory, the institutional change that would save lives beyond just hope. David read it and felt nothing. He was glad for the changes, glad that future operations would have better oversight, glad that his stubbornness had accomplished something tangible. But he could not celebrate policy victories when the people who made the original decision still did not understand what they had done wrong. Ambassador Quinn visited him a month later, finding his ship docked at a small trading station. She brought gifts for Hope and a carefully worded request to discuss the Concordat's ongoing efforts to improve human relations. "They want me to tell them how to make humans trust them again," David said after Hope went to play in the station's recreation area. "Essentially, yes," Quinn admitted. "They do not understand why the policy changes are not enough. They gave you everything you asked for in legal terms. The protocols are stricter than any other military force in the galaxy. But humans are still avoiding Concordat contracts." "Because they still do not get it," David said. "They changed the rules because we forced them to, because it was politically necessary, not because they actually believe every life matters." Telvik retired with full benefits. His subordinates who followed his orders were reassigned, not disciplined. The system protected itself and adjusted the procedures, but the people who think casualties are just numbers are still in charge. Quinn nodded slowly. "So what would be enough? What would make humans forgive?" David looked out at the stars, at the vast, complicated galaxy where millions of species coexisted under fragile agreements and compromises. "Humans do not forgive easily. We remember every slight, every broken promise, every time someone decided our lives did not matter. But we do work with people we do not forgive. We work with former enemies all the time. What we need is not forgiveness. It is trust that you will do better next time." "And how do we build that trust?" Quinn asked. "By actually caring," David said simply. "Not because it is policy or because it is legally required, but because you genuinely believe every person in a conflict zone deserves to be counted. Show us you check for survivors because you want to find them, not because regulations say you have to. Show us you value life because it is life, not because it is politically convenient." Quinn was quiet for a long time. That is asking for a fundamental change in how most species approach warfare. "Yes," David agreed. "It is. Humans know we are weird about this. We know most species think we take irrational risks for marginal gains, but we cannot change how we are built. We see a child in the rubble and we check. We see someone left behind and we go back. That is not negotiable for us. So either the Concordat learns to value what we value or we keep our distance. Simple as that." Quinn left that conversation understanding why the Concordat was struggling. You could not policy your way into caring. You could not procedure your way into valuing individual lives. Either you believed people mattered or you did not, and humans could tell the difference. Years passed. The Concordat's new protocols saved lives, prevented casual disregard for civilian safety, created accountability that had not existed before. David's case became famous in human culture as an example of one stubborn person changing an entire military alliance. Hope grew up, became an advocate for war survivors, spoke at conferences about the importance of verification and accountability. David never accepted the Concordat's commendation. He never forgave Telvik. He never stopped being angry that he had to fight so hard for something so obvious. But he also never stopped checking wreckage for survivors, never stopped believing that someone had to care, never stopped being exactly the kind of annoying, persistent, impossible human that the galaxy had learned to respect. Because that was what humans did. They found the people everyone else forgot. They fought the fights everyone else abandoned. They refused to accept that some lives were just collateral damage, and they never, ever stopped being a problem for anyone who thought otherwise. The child was labeled Collateral. The honey badger called it war. And in the end, the war changed how an entire galaxy measured the value of a single life. That was not victory, not in any traditional sense. But it was something, and for David Ross, that was enough.